Hello, Charlotte.
Hello, Andrea.
So today we are going to meet Charlotte, who is an excellent yoga teacher, and she will be teaching in Ubuntu Bali starting April 19th,
Yes.
and that's a Tuesday,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll be teaching at 10 o'clock
Yes.
for an hour and a half,
Yes.
and you will be teaching what?
I will be teaching something that we decided to call Mindful Ashtanga. We want to bring an aspect of the subtle body, so the chakra system, actually into the practice. As some of you might know or not, even just the sun salutation in itself is actually an activation of all the different chakras. So we can also bring a focus to one specific chakra into one class. This means that there will be a focus on a specific part of the body in that practice, but there will also be an intention setting and a meditative focus at the end of the practice that is also focused on this specific chakra.
Okay. So, and that's a guided class, and then you will be talking about all these different systems, etc. And then obviously you can't fit all the chakras in one class, so you will teach it like sort of gradually.
Yes, we'll be teaching one chakra per class.
Okay.
And it doesn't necessarily need to be chakra 1, 2, 3, 4. It doesn't really matter, because it's more, what's really interesting is that we'll work on the kind of emotional and mindset factors of what we associated with each and one of the chakras as well.
Okay.
So we can absolutely work one day on grounding and working on how we deal with fear in a focused physical class that has a lot of stability and, let's say, balancing poses, and then which would be the first chakra. And then the next day we could work on chakra 3, for instance. So I'll be teaching 3 times a week, Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday at 10, which means that we don't necessarily need to work on the same chakra each week.
Okay. Okay. Sounds very interesting. And you're an Ashtanga practitioner.
I am.
Yeah. And how long have you been practicing for?
So I've been practicing Ashtanga since 2014.
Okay.
Yeah.
And teaching Ashtanga?
I have been teaching Ashtanga as well, yes, absolutely. I first actually came in contact with Ashtanga when I went to Mysore, not necessarily with the intention of learning Ashtanga, but then that's how it happened. And then from Mysore I arrived in Bali and stumbled upon Damien and Andrea, you two.
Oh. And here we are again.
Exactly. And so since then I have both practiced with you and been teaching alongside with you guys as well.
Yeah. And so what year was that? When
That was actually it was like December 2014 that I arrived
Wow,
here. Yeah.
we've known each other for that long.
I
Ooh. We go way back. Okay, and tell me a little bit, you don't only teach Ashtanga, you also teach other classes. You have a huge toolbox. Which other classes do you teach?
Well, so I actually originally I have a classical training, so Hatha classical yoga, which I also teach, and I teach yin yoga as well, because it's a good way to balance them out, I think. But one thing that over the more recent years I've started to integrate more and more is the fact that I'm also an Ayurvedic practitioner. And so in Ayurveda, the yoga practice is like the tool that we use in order to work on some of the physical aspects as well. And so it's very interesting to use whether it's Ashtanga or Hatha yoga, or which both are, I guess, but the classical version, or even the more restorative and yin from an Ayurvedic perspective as well, so that we work more with the subtle kind of qualities that we need to balance out in the body.
Okay. And so who would you say would be more prone to come to, let's say, a classic Hatha yoga class?
A classic Hatha yoga class would be, for instance, anyone, of course, who just wants to practice yoga. But it's also a wonderful way to start your journey with yoga, because you really take it slower than you would in the Ashtanga practice. And it's also less, well, it can be very, very physically demanding, but it can also be, originally it's less physically demanding, I would say. So someone who is starting out, who's getting to really to know their own physical strength and flexibility, if they start with classical Hatha yoga, that's a really good place to start. Yeah.
Okay. And then Yin yoga, who would you say would be?
So Yin yoga is, for all those Mysore practitioners out there, a good way to balance out the heat. It is for everyone, absolutely. I would say that Yin yoga is our tool to level out a little bit all the dynamic things that we do in life in general. So it means that anyone who practices any kind of physical exercise, no matter which one actually, that are usually heating, which means that you bring heat into the body, you sweat and you move, etc., you will naturally have a tendency to need to cool down at some point. And so Yin yoga is really there for that. And it's also, what's really beautiful about Yin yoga, I think, is the fact that many of the practices that we do to heat ourselves up are also a way to kind of surpass ourselves and to push a little bit more, whereas Yin is all about the opposite. It's almost, can I go less deep than my body allows me to, just to be able to sit. It's almost as if I practice meditation and I just move a little bit every 3-4 minutes or so. Yeah.
So it's a moving meditation.
Yes.
Yeah, but you lay and you stretch for a long time, and as you're there, you meditate and go really deep in body and mind and every aspect of it. Right?
Absolutely.
Very good. And now we're kind of assuming that everybody knows what Ashtanga is. So let's not assume. Let's get Charlotte to share a bit of her Ashtanga experience and what it is. What is Ashtanga?
Well, so Ashtanga is the modern type of yoga, I guess we would call it, which is a physical exercise in a certain way. But because it's also called Ashtanga, it's actually so much more than that. It's the whole kind of aspect of what we call the 8 limbs of yoga, which is integrated in this system that therefore implements physical practice, breathing, and also all of the other parts that would be more concentration and then going into deeper meditation and potentially going all the way to samadhi.
Blissful. And okay, so these are your yoga tools per se. Now tell us a little bit more about Ayurveda. What is Ayurveda? Like, not everybody knows what Ayurveda is.
Absolutely. So Ayurveda is the Indian science, let's say, Indian medicine. Just the same way that many people know of Chinese medicine. Well, there's one as well from India. And actually the Indian medicine, or Ayurveda, which means actually science of life, Ayurveda, is the oldest medicinal science that we know of. And we can trace it back to already 5,000 years ago. Now, Ayurveda evolved or developed at the same time as yoga, actually, which is why it's often called sister sciences. And they work perfectly well together. One actually brings the health aspect into the physical practice, and the other bring also kind of, I would say, the spiritual practice into the medicinal practice. And so Ayurveda is a holistic approach to life in general and to the universe. So it's based on Samkhya and the Vedas, just like yoga is, which means that we speak about the 5 elements and also the bioenergies that are manifested through the 5 elements, which we call the 3 doshas. And so everything in nature, as well as ourselves, are made up of these doshas, or the elements, which means that if we live in harmony with the external environment through our internal environment, that's how we actually find longevity. And so basically the practice of Ayurveda is to maintain our youth as long as possible.
Recipe for youth forever.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And okay, so what Ayurveda, as you said, it's very broad, right? Like it has the doshas, it has the food, it has a lot of aspects to it. So what part of Ayurveda would you say you're more drawn to? What is it that calls you more?
Well, I would say that it's what I'm really drawn towards is this idea of balancing out our own personal tendencies in this life that is unfortunately not very balanced in itself anymore. So actually Ayurveda, the practices, the different routines that they recommend were created for urban living. At one point when society developed and that we were kind of disconnected from just living with nature and living with the sun basically, we also realized that our bodies were more difficult to maintain in balance. And so these practices are there for householders, so for everyone living anywhere in the world, in order to kind of find our way back to balance again. And me, myself, especially, I've noticed through the years in my yoga practice when I started to learn about myself, I've been going in and out of balance so much because of my own personal maybe convictions or tendencies and wanting to always push more. Most people who are drawn to Ashtanga yoga, for instance, are kind of people who like to push themselves.
Really? I don't know what you're talking about.
And so I found that it was really fascinating that by understanding the principles of Ayurveda and then applying them in just small ways with routines, or for instance what you're eating, when you're eating, what you're doing, at what time you're doing it, you can actually balance yourself out in a really beautiful way. And because of this very holistic approach, what it did as well was that it also came to complement for me something that I had from my background since I studied clinical psychology from the West. So the two actually marries very well together.
I was going to get to that. So you studied psychology, and obviously clinical psychology is not necessarily very spiritual, and it's quite sort of scientific based. So how do you see these sort of, well, not these two, because you have more than Ayurveda, so if we say everything, how do you see the spiritual practice, let's say, and the holistic practice? How do you see that come into fusing with clinical psychology? How do they two match and help each other?
I think that it's almost a way to not do what's very common, which would be to bypass certain things. I believe that a lot of people, I think that when we go into spirituality, no matter which kind, it's like a medicine. If we take it the right way, it can heal us. If we take it the wrong way, it can kill us. And what I mean by that is that just the same way as when you would open the Yoga Sutras and it begins with now yoga begins, it implies that there's a work that's been done prior to that. And I believe that a lot of people who might need actually to do some therapeutic work before they start spirituality would benefit from having that, because we tend to bypass what's uncomfortable. So basically, I think that from the spiritual perspective, bringing an aspect that's more therapeutical from the clinical psychology into it can help, because it allows for people to acknowledge that there's sides of ourselves that we don't really want to look at. And it's so easy just to be then spiritual instead and as if we're forgetting all about it. And it works then, of course, on the other end as well, because we also have, as you said, it's very kind of scientifically based in a certain way, depends on what you look at, but it's also a way to bring spirit into the clinical practice, and which is also becoming more and more common these days, because instead of going from the head and down, let's say, as you work from a clinician's point of view, they're working much more now from the body and upwards, which means that they integrate as well just basically the nervous system in a different way, and which is finding peace, for instance.
So just for my own understanding, I because I've been very interested in all of these topics myself, so my understanding is that therapy as such, like psychology, is a way to look at our history, because we all come with different luggage, we have our own stories, some are more serious than others, and we want to blame our parents, of course. Everything is their fault. And then I also obviously came on to this path of self-discovery. So what I found was that it's all good that we go into the mental and we explore what we're being triggered by and why. But I also think that it's very important to not just stay with that, because I myself went to psychotherapy, and I was feeling like, you know, we can just keep going, and years could go by and I'm still going there, because there's always something coming up in every session, and then you have to go back and figure that one out, and so luckily my therapist left. Sessions finished naturally, and the last session he told me, actually there's nothing wrong with me. I'm like, oh, you're telling me this now after you cashed in? And no, I'm joking. And so I then obviously had the opportunity to look at all these things, but also on a spiritual level, you know, and on a new age level, I would say, it's become a little bit tricky, where we read about we should be happy, we should, you know, life should be blissful, etc. So it's very easy, like you said, to bypass, right? So how do we know actually when it's mental, and not to get stuck in the mental and keep, you know, fixing it, fixing the problem? So what I come to learn from my own experience is that it's actually more somatic. It's coming into the body and then recognizing when this starts to go ding, 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 the story comes up, whatever it might be, and we're starting to feel this discomfort that we're avoiding. That we then go into the body and check in, okay, what are the sensations that we're feeling? And that's how all these tools, all these come together, and we can use both psychology, both the how we balance our life, obviously, how we eat, how we sleep, what environment we put ourselves in, what we say, what we listen to, and then how we use yoga with that is bringing the sensations in, right? So going deeper and then bringing all those three together.
Absolutely. You know, I think our physical bodies are a manifestation of basically all our past experiences, which means that the way I feel and look today is just the sum of what I've done to myself, right? And so that means that not only is all those experiences still traced in the body, and this is why the therapeutic path can be very helpful, because the fact of bringing it to the surface, to acknowledging it, helps us as well to disarm it and to kind of destigmatize it as well. And then through the physical practice, what happens, as most people who've done any kind of practice actually, it doesn't even have to be necessarily yoga, but they notice as well that things come up as they move in their body. And they also maybe notice that whatever they do to themselves on the mat might resemble some kind of pattern of behavior that what they have also off the mat. So absolutely. And even just
But could you give an example? What do you mean, like behavior on the mat?
oh, well, very typical just from my own personal experience. I would, especially with the Ashtanga practice, would tend to push myself and injure myself. And what was going on really was that I was defining myself through what I was capable of doing on the mat. And especially then, if you're also then, of course, a teacher, then it means that you should, you should be, there's so many ideas around that as well, where you should be in your practice. And it took me quite some time before I really had to understand that it was more of being humble and maybe do less sometimes that would heal me in my practice. And because that came to the surface so quickly, so intensely, so manifested, because it's my body, then I started relating that to things that I would do as well in my life. And how we're all these, I was this overachiever wanting to prove more, and then kind of stopping and just be like, okay, so what am I making this mean? If I don't overachieve, is there something wrong? Yeah.
And now?
And now I think it's a lifelong journey. But I believe that I've learned a really good lesson, and I even noticed that my practice changed for the better actually when I stopped kind of using it as a way to kind of punish myself.
Or for self-affirmation.
Yeah.
Right? To reassure that you can do all this, therefore you're good,
Exactly.
etc.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to be there and meet yourself on that day, because as human we change every day. We have different things we deal with in life, in our body, and so forth. And it's very important to, like what you said there, being humble and really respect where we're at.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Rather than running after the next pose or trying to use the practice as yet another podium, I would say. Yeah. So, well, I'm glad we have achieved the same insights.
Yes.
Yeah. No gold stars to be given at the end. But okay, so I was just wrap up here and want to understand. What do I want to understand? I want to understand how do you fit all this into one class? Like you're bringing all these elements into one class.
Yeah.
What would you say is your magic trick here to bring into your students?
You have to come and see.
Yeah, of course.
I think that what I try to do is that by using the yogic practice and then integrating through that whatever we associate on a more mental level. So for instance, let's say that we would have a class where we would focus on the third chakra, Manipura chakra, right? And in a lot of ways we can speak about this chakra on a more subtle level as something empowering. It's situated also, in the digestive system with the digestive fire, and just like the fire inside of us, and the strength and the self kind of empowering part of ourselves. The drive, exactly. But it's also what really kills this side of ourselves is the very strong negative emotion of shame, for instance. And we have all been taught shame very early on in life, and it manifests in different ways in our lives. So by, for instance, using a physical practice that is focusing on strengthening the third chakra, but then having an intention setting around it where I might speak a little bit about how shame can manifest in our lives. And then each person obviously sets their own personal intention because it's so personal for each and one of us. But then doing this practice that can then be a way to want to push ourselves and to overheat almost, then also bringing in a quality that is much more sattvic, so a much more lightness into it. So I guess that would be a way for me to try to kind of combine all these facets that the yoga and the Ayurveda and the more Western approach as well, because it's also the fact that it's sometimes very hard as a modern human being to integrate some of these ideas that comes from these old, beautiful philosophies with the different kind of obligations and expectations that exists now. So I think that there's a gentle approach from the psychology in there. Yeah.
So it's more fusing East with West.
Yes.
And seeing how the two can meet, and how the Eastern philosophy and, I don't want to say tools again because I feel like I'm repeating myself, but the Eastern way of living can be met with the Western way of living, because it is quite different how we been approaching life. I mean, I would say in the East they're much more focused on spirituality and how we bring that into the modern life, even though the East is changing rapidly and moving away from that.
Yeah.
But I think now it's time for us to bring it back together. But how do the two meet, and how can we not go backwards in time but forwards, and how do we use what we learned along the way, the wisdom, and get rid of what is not serving us anymore, right? Like you say, the ambition and the drive that been on overheat and overrun, and we have to be something and somewhere, and this constant chasing to be better,
to improve,
and that I'm not good enough is what we hear a lot, right? So I mean, I think it's a very interesting approach, and I think it's a necessary approach actually, where we bring everything together and apply what we have learned from both sides, since we are from a Western world and we've studied the Eastern world, but and then how do we translate that, and how do we translate it to our audience, our students, right? Okay, well, thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thank you.
We look forward to having you teaching in Ubuntu.
Me too.
And so April 19th, Charlotte is going to start at 10 a.m. to teach 3 classes a week, Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays. And we look forward to have you join her classes. So we'll see you all on the mat.
Yes, see you on the mat.
Thank you.